cannot recall any colleague who could paint a self-portrait with absolute honesty. This quote from the narrator of An Artist of Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro nicely sets the tone for the novel. It's a reflection on shame, memory, war guilt, and the way we move on from the past. Back to my series on Kazuo Ishiguro. This is the second novel of his that we're reading. We're going through them at a rate of one a month, so check out my previous video if you haven't already. We're eventually aiming to read Clara and the Sun, his latest release. We're following directly on from his previous novel, which was also set in post-war Japan. We joined the novel in October 1948, 3 years after the end of the Second World War, a war which drastically upended Japanese society and has now resulted in American occupation of the country. Our narrator is Masuji Ono, an old retired artist now living with his youngest daughter Noriko, following the death of his wife and oldest son as a result of the war. They acquired the house they live in through a rigorous process which is described to us at the start of the novel, in which Ono's character was deemed as suitable for someone coming into ownership of that house. We join the novel in a time where Ono's oldest daughter Setsuko is visiting with her son Ichiro. The characters are involved in a marriage negotiation for his youngest daughter Noriko following the failure of a marriage negotiation in the previous year. It's suggested that Ono's behaviour is one of the primary reasons that the previous marriage negotiation failed to go through. Setsuko suggests to her father that he make preparations in advance of this match to make sure it goes better. Meanwhile, we catch glimpses of Ono's pre-war life, both in a seedy bar that he frequents in the pleasure district owned by a Mrs. Kawakami, and through his artistic journey. He goes from a painter working on art essentially for Westerners, so depicting typical Japanese ideas such as koi and cherry blossom and geisha, and he moves away from this to following a tutor called Mori-san, who works on more ephemeral ideas of pleasure and the floating world of the novel's title. Ono eventually reaches the point where he's leading his own art school and his own art pupils and becomes an influential figure within the art world. In the present, the marriage negotiations run into a stumbling block when it's revealed that Dr. Saito, the father of the groom-to-be, has run into Kuroda, an old student of Ono's. Ono takes precautionary steps, visiting an old friend called Matsuda. When speaking to him, he asks him to leave out some of the details of the activities that the two of them took part in the past. Matsuda relents and says that he won't reveal all the details to any marriage investigators, though he does say that he thinks there's much the two of them have to be proud of in the past. He also visits Kuroda and is surprised when he's turned away by one of Kuroda's students, and is quite disappointed because he wanted to bury the hatchet in person. A further letter from Kuroda kind of reveals that Kuroda's firmly of the opinion that there's no point in any kind of meeting between the two of them, although it does politely thank him for coming to see him. Eventually, what is hinted throughout the novel is elucidated as we find out that Matsuda took Ono directly away from working for Mori-san and instead took his art to more straightforwardly propagandist ways. Ono insists that he wants to use his artistic skills to make a difference in society. One of his pieces depicts greedy financiers prevaricating while free soldiers bravely declare that they're ready to start the fight and fight for their freedom. Ono even earns a place on a committee of unpatriotic activity and reports his former pupil Kuroda to be investigated by them. So clearly he becomes wrapped up in Japan's imperial ambitions as part of his work. However, in the present, Ono is at a miai, a meeting between his family and the family of his potential son-in-law. He comes out with a bold statement apologising for his wrongdoing in the past, something that puzzles the people sitting around the table. However, he notes that the entire atmosphere is a lot more relaxed afterwards. The marriage negotiations go swimmingly after that. In the end, Ono discusses the precautionary steps he took with his oldest daughter, Setsuko. However, she remarks that she has no memory at all of ever asking him to take such steps. Ono ends the novel reflecting on Japan's future, wishing young people the best of luck, as Mrs. Kawakami's old bar is knocked down and replaced with luxury flats. The novel ends in June 1950, with the Korean War only days away from starting. So I've presented the novel in quite a straightforward way to you, kind of the plot as it's read on a surface level. I do need to make clear that this was for summarization purposes. This isn't at all how it actually reads. What instead we get is a meandering account by a man looking back over his life with guilt and confusion, and he frequently swaps the words that different characters in his narrative say, And yeah, it's not at all a coherent string of thought. I have to tell you, this man does love to meander. He loves to meander. Not only does he frequently jump around from topic to topic, flashback to flashback, but he, in a classic Ishiguro fashion, repeatedly questions his own narrative. He apologises for digressing. At one point he says to the reader, you may think I've taken too much credit here. He clarifies that things that he said might not actually have been his own words, and words that other characters said might not have been their words. Indeed, in some cases, the words that characters said are actually attributed to people that spoke 10 years later on from them. This leads us to our classic Ishiguro Switchiguro of the novel. In the final few pages, he talks with his daughter about the precautionary steps he takes, and as we've already said, she has no recollection of him ever being asked to take precautionary steps. But it's more than that. She also states that she's heard concerning things about him. These are concerns that her father has been talking to the younger Sato about a man called Yukio Naguchi, a composer whose works were used for propagandist purposes in the war and who had recently committed suicide. Now, this isn't the first time at all that Ono has been referring to this idea of kind of a penitential suicide in the novel. The former chief executive of the kind of almost former son-in-law of Ono committed suicide as an apology to his company, who he deemed to have failed during the war. However, Setsuko expresses huge concern that her father is even considering taking the same action. She states that Naguchi had enormous prevalence during the war and that there was actually some substance to his apology, whereas she describes her father as merely a painter. Father's work has hardly to do with the matters of which we are speaking, she says. She even denies that Dr. Sato was even aware of her father's career. Yet Ono is fixated on words that Dr. Sato said to him when he first moved in as his neighbour many years ago, that it was a great honour to have an artist of your stature in the neighbourhood. So, what does this conversation mean? Well, there's kind of a few different ways you can take a look at it. Firstly, we could just kind of look at it from the point of view that Setsuko is lying in this scene, that she's worried about her father, who is potentially showing signs that he might himself be wanting to commit suicide, something that she obviously doesn't want to happen. Alternatively, we could believe that Ono has been lying to us throughout this entire narrative. His guilt and shame have built to such a point where he's outright fabricating conversations. So insistent is he that he must make up for what it is he's done in the past. But indeed, he is making up for what he's done in the past, he believes. And so delusional is he that he was a grand, influential figure in the war, whereas in reality, maybe he just was a painter. Repeatedly, he mentions other characters in the novel telling him how influential he is, how he's such an influential guy who's able to make such a difference to people's careers. So clearly he has a lot of value tied to the fact that he is an important person. We shouldn't forget that this is a war that's cost him his wife and his son, so it's very natural to be feeling a huge amount of regret over that. Likely though, it's a combination of the two. Ono is absolutely exaggerating aspects of his life. Like, there is no doubt in my mind, and there should be no doubt in the mind of the reader. But that's something we all do, to an extent. So is it really that surprising? Yeah, his influence was clearly large enough that he was able to end up on a committee, that he was able to ruin people's lives directly as he did with Kuroda. At points he even ruins lives in the narrative without even really admitting it, such as with one of the pupils at Mori-san's villa. This man is cast out as a traitor away from the floating world after his work starts to take on creative differences. Straightforwardly reading the narrative, it seems that this is something that Ono doesn't have much to do with. And yet this guy, Sasako, opens the door next to Ono's and speaks to the person that reported them, saying, "Why have you done this? Where are my paintings? I know it was you." All he gets back in return is silence. Reading between the lines here, it seems pretty clear that it was Ono himself who actually reported him and who has hidden the paintings. And this influence does continue, even to one of his close friends to this day, Shintaro, who essentially asks Ono to separate himself from him in order for Shintaro to get a teaching position by saying, "Look, we disagreed on a position on Manchuria, didn't we? We definitely disagreed." So I mean, clearly, to an extent, he was influential in the art world and his views were problematic. However, Ono's repeated switching around of events does mean that we can't take for granted anything in the narrative. On top of that, there's a possibility of selective forgetting that his daughter, that Dr. Saito, that all the people around him are choosing to ignore this aspect of their father's life in order to kind of settle and move on. And the fact of the matter is, this kind of thing wasn't necessarily openly talked about. So Dr. Saito's surprise when it's brought up was genuine. Oh, that's the thing with these unreliable narrators. They are not at all reliable. So, for our next theme, a brief note on the title of the novel. The Floating World is actually a direct translation of the word ukiyo-e, which is kind of those Japanese woodblock print arts that you'll probably have seen. In this sense, the title reflects the work that he was doing with Mori-san, the artist that he worked under, who was interested in ephemeral stuff, in beauty. Their work was modernising the old Utamaro art style by bringing in new Western, softer lines in order to kind of portray the beauty of the world around them. Specifically, Mori-san refers to the pleasure district, to the fact that he wanted his work to reflect the idea of a lantern's light. They wanted transistory, illusory work. Their villa was a site of pleasure with kind of artists and dancers and actors coming in and out and yeah, just passing out on the floor basically. However, despite being all for it originally, Ono rejects this idea of the floating world after meeting the nationalist Matsuda, who he originally misidentifies as a communist, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about his political knowledge. He's shown 3 children starving on the street by Matsuda, and this kind of drives him towards using his art for purpose. He takes the 3 children and puts them in a painting called Complacency, in which kind of targets those who are doing nothing for the poor of society. This transitions fairly quickly into pure propaganda. His friend, the tortoise, is shocked by this shift, and his tutor, Mori-san, ejects him from the floating world after seeing one of his pieces of art. There's a quote, "Sensei, it is my belief that in such troubled times as these, artists must learn to value something more tangible. My conscience, Sensei, tells me I cannot forever remain an artist of the floating world." That's the title. Ayo. This, of course, is presented by Ono, so, like, let's not take him at face value, lads. He wants to present the story as kind of a narrative towards progress, you know? He goes from commercial to ephemeral to eventually being a pure intentioned nationalist, and then it all goes wrong when it turns out, oh no, those ideas he was propagating were actually not that great. But we shouldn't necessarily let him drive the narrative like that. There's a revealing passage where Ono talks about his teacher Mori-san and says, yo, so obviously he treated his pupils very harshly, they all worshipped him, you know, but you can't really blame him for letting that culture develop around him. You should certainly not blame him for any of the steps that he took with his students. And like, okay lad, you're clearly talking about you here, you can't hide that from us. He also draws a parallel from when Mori-san destroys his paintings to when his father destroyed his paintings during his childhood. His father wanted him to go into kind of a business side of things, but Ono was always more interested in the art and achieving something great. So it's interesting that he would draw this parallel. Mori-san also states powerfully, no man will make me believe that my life's work was wasted. And clearly, again, that's Ono saying that about his own life. There's a bit of a novel I haven't talked about yet, the final theme, which is kind of to do with Ono's relationship with his grandson, Ichiro. He's obsessed with cowboys, specifically the Lone Ranger, and we actually know from interviews that Ishiguro put that in specifically because it was his own childhood. He was himself obsessed with cowboys and the Lone Ranger, which is absolutely adorable. I wanna be a cowboy, baby. Anyway, Ono says to his grandson, let's go see this big scary monster movie, a monster movie that is quite clearly Godzilla. His daughters are stridently against it, being fully aware that Ichiro is way too young to see such a movie. Ichiro postures around saying, oh, these women are going to be scared. They're so scared, aren't they, grandfather? They're so scared of this monster. And yet, when he gets into the theatre, he himself kind of does his raincoat so tight that he can't see anything. He can't see the movie at all. And yet, when he's out of the movie, he's going on about how it wasn't scary at all, how he was such a brave person, how he was so strong. Now, what's going on here? Well, in part it's to do with the fact that Godzilla was a film specifically designed in order to portray fears around nuclear destruction and the bomb. The metaphor of a child hiding under a raincoat so that they can't see the horrors of what's going on, to me seems a fairly clear metaphor. Part of it is also to do with Ono's insistence on masculine values and sticking to the tradition of the past. This continues when he promises his grandson that he can get him sake, Japanese alcohol, later on. He's unable to do it, but rather than Ichiro being disappointed with that, we actually see that it's Ono that's the one that's mostly disappointed with that, and Ichiro ends up comforting his grandfather over it, saying, it's okay you didn't get me the sake, it's alright. This suggests that it's obviously a lot more about Ono's way of controlling things than it is about his grandsons. This generational divide is important, and it continues to be important when we see the three colleagues meeting outside of the glass building at the end of the novel. One of them is described as laughing with the innocence of a child. These three men are direct parallel to the three starving children that are seen earlier in the novel, and the three soldiers that Ono eventually turns that painting into. On the face of this could be seen as an optimistic end to the novel. After all, those children were starving, and now they seem to be happy and flourishing. Timothy Wright notes, however, this is kind of a surface covering what action Japan will be taking in the next few years, whether it's involvement in the Korean War or acting on behalf of America as a kind of a bastion against communism in Asia. In an era when the threat of the atomic bombing is still there, his wish of good luck to this men is genuine, but it is jaded. I think this novel was very successful in building up on the themes that we saw in A Pale View of Hills. And many of the themes that we saw here will be carried on in next month's novel, The Remains of the Day, which is a novel he won the Booker Prize for. Subscribe for more content on Ishiguro and book discussion in general, and I will see you next time.